Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Assessment and Instruction in Distance and Blended Learning Programs. The focus of this webinar is how we can minimize the distance in distance learning and the online part of blended learning so that we can support student persistence and help students feel more connected while they're engaged in distance work. Teachers are the key to this, as well as quality online learning tools. So we're going to be hearing a little bit about how teacher involvement is seen as critical in this work and how it's played out in several programs that I've been working with over the years. This work is done through IDEAL Consortium, which is a group of leaders, PD leaders, technology leaders, innovative teachers from across several states, 14 states now, who share effective practice and support each other through policy considerations. We at the Tech Center facilitate this through convening every August and supporting an online community of practice. I want to say also that this work is made possible by the System for Adult Basic Education Support, or SABES, in Massachusetts. SABES prompted these webinars and was gracious enough to open them up to others in the IDEAL Consortium member states, which you can see listed here in the map. All the states in red are part of IDEAL. And I'm Jen Vanek. I am the facilitator of the conversations amongst the wonderful people and educators within these states, and happy to engage you in the conversation, extend the conversation to you today too. So our agenda is going to be much the same as the two previous webinars. As I said, this is the third and final in a series of three on effective practice that's presented in the IDEAL Consortium Distance and Blended Learning Handbook. Mike, maybe you could throw a link to the handbook in the chat just for people who aren't familiar with it. So we're just going to find out who's here. I'm going to talk about some research. I'll talk about some key implementation areas, and then we'll get to some examples of work and have you actually then share what it is you're doing in these areas. Okay, so first, if you could find your chat, if you haven't migrated or found it or navigated it, gotten it open, could you please find your chat? I'm going to do that right now by clicking on the thought bubble that's in the doc at the bottom of the page. And opening that, that's going to open a pop-up in the lower right-hand corner. Once you get there, you can see that Mike has chatted the link to the blog post. And the handbook, which is on the website, Mike, that could also go in there. I would love it if everybody could tell me what your role is in the work that you're doing. You could just chat that. Are you a teacher, a researcher? Are you state APE staff? Are you a teacher educator, program administrator, technology specialist? Just give me a sense of who is in the room. So it looks like we've got a mix of people, a lot of teachers. It's really great. Some program specialists, some professional development. Welcome, Luann from SABES, and thanks for making this webinar available to everybody. Great. So a very solid mix of people here. Let's learn from each other. So chat your questions and comments throughout the webinar, and Mike will flag me as things pop up. I'll stop periodically and be checking the chat area. Okay, so this webinar is actually based on a blog post that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, actually end of May, called Considerations for Effective Distance and Blended Instruction and Assessment. The handbook is the sort of foundation for all of this work, but I took the relevant portions of the handbook and created a blog post that included some updates and some updated examples. So if you are interested in reading about some of the stuff that we'll be talking about here, I encourage you to check out the handbook and the blog post. The links to both are posted in the chat. Okay, so the work of the day starts with considerations for how we support teachers and their communication with learners. It is, for programs getting started with distance learning especially, there is a bias or sort of a tendency to rely too much on the online curriculum that's been purchased to support all of the instruction and most of the communication, the direct feedback in the auto-graded quizzes and stuff like that. But what I've seen in the nearly 10 years I've been working with IDEAL member states and within my own state of Minnesota is that the teachers that have learners who actually persist are the teachers that spend more time in direct communication with these learners, both inside and outside of their online curriculum. So those teachers then actually were able to do that because their programs provided support that actually gave the teachers time to plan assignments and grading and providing feedback to online work, and then actually also time to communicate with learners. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see programs trying out DL for the first time is that they don't give teachers time to communicate with learners. Distance learning requires a programmatic shift and a realignment of resources so that teachers can actually still teach, just in a different way. So the second thing is that the second area around communication is that these programs and teachers that succeed actually have multiple modes of communication, and they're flexible and are able to meet students' needs. So if they know a student is coming in for a regular class once a week, they'll schedule time during office hours, like have an in-person check-in. For learners who live really far away in a rural area but have access to video conferencing, those check-ins can still be synchronous, right, but not necessarily in person. They can have a video conference. For learners without that kind of technology, online discussion and email can be drawn on. So the idea is that teachers or distance learning programs are equipped to offer multiple modes of communication depending on the skills and level of support and type of support that they come to understand as necessary for any individual student. So this is sort of how we went going into this study that I'm about to talk about. I worked with Jerry Johnston, who was the actual founder and ran the project, what was then Project IDEAL at the University of Michigan, until his retirement when we shifted this work to the Tech Center at World Ed and renamed it IDEAL Consortium. I worked with Jerry and Joe Hart, who was then state director, distance learning coordinator for the state of Arizona, and Destiny Long, now Destiny Simpson, who is doing similar work in Pennsylvania. And we had a sense that communication was really important in persistence, in distance, just from prior research and from our own work as researchers. So we decided to convene a study group to really get to the bottom of this. So each of us in our states, and actually Eunice May, who participated in this group, Eunice, as many of you from Massachusetts will recall, was deeply involved in the SABIS work and distance learning efforts in Massachusetts. And essentially what we did was went out and we talked to learners who state-level leaders in each of the states found to be doing really innovative work and were known to have students who were persisting. We interviewed the teachers. We met regularly and talked about our interviews, and we combed through all of the data that we collected to find some common themes to arrive at an understanding about what supports communication, what supports engagement, and what makes it possible for these learners to persist. So what we found are these characteristics that you see listed on the screen in front of you. I'm going to go into each one in turn. And give you a chance at the end of each section of the section here to reflect a little bit on which of these categories you are actually making use of in your practice or in your programming where you work. So as I'm going through, start to kind of take notes and jot down. So I'm actually going to have like a reflection time at the end of this and a chance for you to post some observations in the chat when we get there. So we're making use of one primary curriculum, making use of OER, coordinating all of those resources in a centralized website, use blended learning, make use of online lab or provide other support for access, and the teachers consider themselves as lifelong learners. So we'll just get into these a little bit. So this idea that effective practice involved use of one primary online curriculum. I don't want to imply that that was the only way that instruction happened, and this involved instruction model. But what I do want you to know is that both the teachers and each individual learner knew that the learner was focused primarily on one online curriculum. So that was the place from which everything else stemmed. The benefit to this is that teachers really get to know a curriculum. So there were many programs that were maybe like even statewide, a state would approve just one or two online curricula for their states. I know Massachusetts has approved KET, and Luann, feel free to chat the list for Massachusetts. But these are common curricula that are used in ABE programs, but I know around the U.S., KET, Aztec is the one up in the left corner, Essential Ed, USA Learns, Cell Ed is the one in the lower right, and Odyssey-ware are commonly used in programs. If a state says this is the one we're paying for everybody, then the choice is easy because that's the one that is most affordable. And teachers tend to start there with their students. The advantage, if you're making a decision like this at the state level, is that the state is able to provide a high level of technical support and professional development around use of the curriculum. At this level of support can be repeated at the programmatic level. Let's say a state offers a couple, and a program decides that one, they know their learners have lots of flip phones, but not a lot of smartphones. So they decide to go with Cell Ed, which is useful on any kind of device. So they focus on that as a program. And I've seen really interesting scenarios where programs will create communities of practice or professional learning communities around use of a mobile online tool so that teachers can really get to know it. And then they can support each other with the expertise that they gain. On the other side, on the student side, students will gain comfort with navigation if they're focused on one online space initially. And this is really important for learners who are brand new to distance learning and brand new to using computers. It's almost like they need to be shown how to navigate with some structured support in orientation, like we talked about in the previous webinar. But then just through use of the tool, the same tool, they're able to develop a resilience to little things that pop up when they're working online. They get used to solving problems. They get used to understanding what hyperlinks do. So giving a student that time and that opportunity to do that is really important. About 10 years ago, there was a study done in South Central Minnesota of just an ABE program director decided he wanted to see if this was actually true. So he had a very sort of informal randomized control study where one group of teachers used two online learning primary curricula with a couple of students. So each student had to log in 50-50 on each one. And another teacher just used one. And in fact, it was true that in that setting, specifically, the use of the one tool was actually much better for the student. They persisted longer, they had fewer problems, and they were able to make more progress. Okay, so the second area of practice. I hope this doesn't sound contradictory. What I mean to do here is to add a layer of complexity to what I just talked about. And that is that, yes, you need to have a primary online curriculum, have students going within that for a little while. And then as you see that students are ready to take on new technology challenges and expand their learning opportunities, it's a really good idea to start integrating supplemental resources for them for additional practice or for a different way to explain something. Just identifying and recognizing where your online proprietary, licensed curriculum that you're using might not align with the needs of a given learner on a particular topic or learning issue. When that happens, the teachers in our study turned to supplemental instruction. So it was obvious to the learner that this was the extra stuff, like, okay, you've tried the same lesson in Aztec or whatever, Essential Ed for, a couple of weeks. We're not getting there. Here's some extra practice from Khan Academy. Or here's some interesting things that we found in open education resources that we think will help you with this particular issue. When we first started talking about this, OER, Open Ed resources, were fairly new in the world of adult education. There is an interesting site where you can find a broad range of Open Ed resources. It's oercommons.org, I think. I think it's a .org. Mike, you could check that out for me. That'd be great. Essentially, Open Ed resources are materials, resources, could be curricula, lesson plans, activities, videos, but they are shared. They're made by teachers and or community-based organizations and shared broadly, so that others can pick up the work, adapt it to their learning, to their learners, and make use of them. So what we have today is a slightly different scenario, and what I want to share with you here, actually I got to get the link myself. The Crowd Ed Learning is a new nonprofit that has made it its work to support the use of OER in adult basic ed. I'm just chatting the link to the skills directory. This is the work of Jeff Gumas, who used to work for a publisher and just didn't see that OER were being being presented to the community of teachers he worked with in any way that would make sense for them. So he's working to build a learning management system that is structured completely on Open Ed resources and will be available to learners for free. So the link that I shared to you and what you can see here in a screenshot is the first step in his work, and that's his skill directory. He has already been working with educators across the U.S. to identify free resources in each of the areas that you can see here. So the basic literacy skills, you can see, are covered. Higher level sort of workplace communication competencies, and then 21st century learning skills. I highly recommend checking out this directory. It's not in a searchable sort of database that you would give to a learner yet, but the product that he's working on is called Skill Blocks. It will be built based on OER resources like this. So it's really new development and useful resource. Interestingly, if anybody is on the call from the state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has assisted and collaborated in development of this, and Pennsylvania actually has an entire Google spreadsheet with all of the CCR competencies and then links to OER that align with those competencies. So this can happen in the classroom level, it can happen in a program level, or if you're from Pennsylvania, there's an example of this happening at the state level, and what Jeff Gumas is trying to do at Crowd Ed Learning is take this to a national level where educators can collaborate in support of the skills directory. So they can use OER and have supplemental resources. Okay, the next area is around use of a digital homeroom. So you can have your proprietary curriculum, you can have supplemental materials, maybe OER. And maybe, when we were talking about orientation, you also said that there would be information that's conveyed to learners during orientation. All of that stuff should be put on one central web interface or website or web page, so that learners have one place they go to first to support all of their learning online, their distance learning online. What you're seeing here is an example of that around digital literacy. This is something that I built a couple of years ago to support digital literacy work in community-based organizations. And I worked with a group of AmeriCorps members to try to organize all of the free resources they were linking out to support computer skill development, but through really unnavigable websites that learners couldn't use directly. So I show this to you as an example of what's possible. This was built in Weebly, which is a totally free online, like web building environment. And without any sort of custom coding or anything, we just used a Weebly template. So it might sound fairly intimidating to say, oh gosh, you've got to build a website to support your distance learners. When with a couple hours and some curiosity and some problem solving, you could go to someplace like Weebly or Wix or Google Sites, and you could figure out how to find the template that's attractive to you and you think would be easy for your learners to navigate, and you could throw resources all in one place. This is an example of another site that was developed by one of the teachers that we talked to back with our study. This is Sharon Ram. She worked in California, and she had a slightly different approach to this, whereas our Weebly was just kind of free and open, and learners could click wherever made sense for them. Sharon had a blended learning class, and she used her website as the way to structure delivery of resources to learners through the blended learning curriculum. So you can see on the right, she actually had the drop-down menu with the different weeks and the activities she wanted learners to link to in those weeks. While learners were doing this, they also, what you can't see on this page lower down, was a link to USA Learns, which was the online curriculum that they were using when they weren't working on the stuff that Sharon had assigned on the drop-down menu in her Weebly site. This is also a Weebly site. So there are multiple ways to go about this. You can have different levels of structure. This is what's called a content management system, meaning it doesn't track learner progress. What you could do if you wanted to go a step further would be to use something like Schoology or Moodle or Canvas and build your course into something called the learning management system, where you could actually then make assignments and have learners talk with each other, and you could it's like another level of complexity. I think the best place to start if you're new to this work is with a simple website like this, where you just have the links. There's a teacher in Texas who is actually, her first step was to use a Google Doc, and she created a series of hyperlinked Google Docs that structured access to these external resources. So you could use, something as simple as a Google Doc too, if you're just getting started. One of the powerful things about using a site like this or a Google Doc like that is that teachers can, John notes that Google Classroom can also be used. That's totally true. And then you can integrate all of your Google apps into that and really push learning on how to use Google. But if you're using something that's open, teachers can collaborate. You don't have to work alone and build your site together. So I fully support any move or decision that makes it possible for teachers to support each other's work. Okay, so I want to pause here just a little bit to see what comments we have. So we've talked about making use of one primary curriculum. We've talked about supplementing that with OER, and we've talked about linking to all of that and whatever is needed from a website, a centralized website. So I'll just give you a second to think of some questions or comments, and then we'll scroll through them. Okay, so I see a question here about the Pennsylvania spreadsheet. I think I can track that down, and I can make sure that Luann has access to it. Luann, that was actually presented at the IDEAL Consortium Institute last summer, so it is definitely in those that resource folder from our meeting. So I can flag it for Luann, and Luann can share it. Kimberly, if you could tell me what state you're from, that would be really helpful. I don't know if you're from, we have a bunch of states on the call. Yeah, you're from Massachusetts, great. We'll make sure that Luann has access to that. A couple other comments supporting use of Weebly and Wix. Yes, it is true. You just add content, and so it's a really nice way to start. Actually, it feels really good to be a creator of digital content. You're putting back into the universe, and you may not know this, but in media literacy, in order to be fully media literate, you actually need to create content. So this allows teachers to explore the depths of their media literacy, and it's a really empowering thing to do. All right, so moving on. The other area that these teachers had in common was they were using a blended learning model. Now, I went into these different ways of considering blended learning in the first webinar, where I encouraged programs to be careful and definitive about the type of programming that they were going to offer. I would want to refer you to the Christian Institute. The Christian Institute has done observational research on the ways that blended learning is represented in different classrooms. I'm not going to take a ton of time to go into these different models right here because you can easily read about them online, and it's better for you to have the links so you can refer to them because they are a little bit complex and it's not always super clear how they vary if I'm just talking through them quickly. But I will say that the one that I've seen work, I guess, with the most ease is the station rotation or the lab rotation. About 5 years ago, the state of Arizona decided that they were going to have every adult basic ed program in Arizona deliver a blended learning model. And they went through a series of activities within each program to help them figure out the needs of their learners, the resources they had available, and then based on thinking about that, choosing which of these blended learning models they wanted to pilot. Most of them chose station rotation, and what that looks like is, imagine a classroom that students might come to a certain number of times a week or every couple of weeks. And in the classroom, there are different stations set up. So there might be a tablet station, or there might be a small group project area, and there might be a place where teachers are doing direct instruction on a particular topic. So students cycle through the rotations depending on their learning needs and the content that's available for the day. The other thing that happens with the station rotation model is then that learning is extended outside of the classroom, and students then have the opportunity to continue working online on their own in some format. Lab rotation is very similar, but students don't have the devices maybe in class, but they're going out to a computer lab. So do check these out. I really think that a strength of the station rotation model is that you can have some hands-on support for digital literacy skill development in your classroom, in your blended learning model. So imagine if you're doing rotation and you have some students who are just not quite getting through the navigation of their online resources, you could have them go do some targeted practice with resources that support learning how to use the internet. Or you could have, maybe you have a volunteer, sit down with a group of students who are having trouble navigating. So those students are getting their digital literacy needs in that while the teacher can be working with other learners on other content. So consider trying it, consider reading a little bit more about it, and do chat and let us know if you're trying any of these models and how it's going, or ask if you have any other questions. In the next area of what I started calling involved instruction, programs and teachers attend to issues of support. Initially, when we wrote about this, because we didn't have such ubiquity of smartphone use, this meant there was an on-site computer lab, or there was a computer on wheels that teachers could make use of. But now, 7 years since we wrote this paper, what we're noticing are other ways to support access. The first successful and widespread program I ever heard about doing this was lending tablets and hotspots. Sherry Lahane and Carissa Tashjian at RiseFly, Rhode Island, and in the libraries in Providence, did this successfully with library patrons who had learning needs. They, of course, also, like other libraries, also have open labs. The sites that do this really well have some sort of online support, maybe a tutor or a volunteer. Maybe programs, just know about all these places that have computer labs, and you can provide information to learners about where they can get online. Another way to think about access is to rely on options for mobile learning or for online learning that have solid mobile options. And it's not necessarily true that, okay, so like 95% of adults in the U.S. now have some sort of cell phone, some sort of phone. All but like 15% of those are smartphones. I understand it's true that not everybody has a data plan that would support extra use for online learning on that smartphone, but you can help students strategize about where they can find free Wi-Fi in order to use their devices for learning. Or you can provide hotspots. But the point here is that you can't expect learners to succeed with blended and distance learning if you don't also put some energy into figuring out how you're going to support their access. The two go hand in hand. Want to say one little thing about mobile devices here. Through the month of August, there are a number of apps that are available to programs for free through the XPRIZE Communities Competition. There are 4 learning apps, and Mike, if you could chat the link to the Team World Ed page, that'd be great. We at the EdTech Center of World Ed are helping anyone who wants to make use of these apps and experiment with using mobile learning in their programs. And you can find out more information on the apps that are available and how you can support your learners in using them by going to the Team World Ed XPRIZE page, which Mike just chatted the link for. CellEd is one of the apps, Learning Upgrade is one, and there's also one called Amrita Learning and Codex, Quest for Lost Words. So there are 4 options. They're very distinct, and I encourage you to check out all of them. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a second to see what the chat has been doing. Looks like Luann is chatting a little bit with some Massachusetts participants about other PD that's on the horizon. Katie wants, we're asking about the Clayton Christensen Academy. Mike, could you just do a quick internet search and chat, or Clayton Christensen Blended Learning. It'll pull up the page and throw that in the chat box. If you have trouble finding it, I can look too. Katie writes that one of the programs in Virginia, Katie is from Virginia, uses a mobile bus with hotspots so that learners can have access. So Katie, that's a really interesting idea. Feel free to chat a few more details about that if anything occurs to you. Oh, great. So Mike will put the Clayton Christensen Institute link there. And Luann also reminds people to offer an IDEA conference. This is support for blended learning in ESL, which is really interesting. August 5th and 6th in Rhode Island. That's great. Thanks, Luann. All right, so the final area of interest, and I guess the final area that's really needed in order for teachers to be embracing involved instruction, is that teachers themselves need to consider their work in this area as continuous learning. I know that it can seem sort of frustrating when you figure something out, something's working really well, and then all of a sudden there's like this new technology that everybody's talking about, and which actually might shift your learners' access. and the way that you can teach them. So for example, like maybe you were using Flash-based technologies, and then all of a sudden you hung on to them, and then they started falling away, and then Google Browser stopped supporting Flash, and then all of a sudden you had to make a shift. There is no static state when thinking about ed tech. Things are always, innovation is always pushing out new ways of work. And as teachers who are engaged in this work, we just really need to be thoughtful about how to integrate these shifts of technology into teaching, because if we don't, that means our technology use in the classroom is not keeping up with the technology demands that the students face outside of the classroom. So my primary driver for thinking about technology use is so that I can be like a structure or scaffold that helps prepare learners for while they're in the classroom, like while they're in programs, so that they do better outside of the classroom. So that's sort of the pull, right? The students are going to, or push, like technology is pushing us, and we need to pull the students along by being that filter and that scaffold. And that doesn't happen without us continually learning about new technologies ourselves. Okay, so what I would like to do here is just pause, and everybody can take out a piece of paper if you want to. And I'm going to give you like a good 5 minutes here to think about how your program or your practice aligns with these different elements of involved instruction. So I'll just pause here, and then also think about how you're communicating with your learners, what opportunities you provide, what channels, how much time you as teachers have to support communication, and just think about how all these things work. So I'm going to pause, and I really encourage you to chat some of your reflections in the chat box in the next 4 or 5 minutes. And Mike, you can maybe pause the recording if you want. I'm drilling into the chat box here. Interested in hearing which of these characteristics are present in your practice, and which like if you had to choose one that you could really put energy into tomorrow, what would you want to do? If you're using one primary curriculum, you can chat what the name of the curriculum is. Chat the link to a supplemental resource that you really enjoy and can think about easily. Or what are you using to coordinate all of your resources? Do you have an on-site lab? And what support do teachers get to be lifelong learners? If you're a teacher and you want more support, what would that support look like? So we have a few things rolling in. I'm really glad, Kathy, to hear that you guys are all you're doing all of these things. That's really wonderful. John's currently using USA Learns, but would like to find something a little more robust. John, I highly encourage one of those mobile apps available through the X Prize during the month of, up through August. It's a free way for you to try out something new. You can also get access to learning management system for many of those free apps, so you can actually see what's going on with your learners' work. I see someone's using Blackboard or Google Classroom. That's great. Oh, yes. So some of them are, yes, John notes that for the X Prize Communities Competition, only CELED and Learning Upgrade are available for iPhones. But those are excellent resources for literacy development. So start with those for sure. The reason the other two are not is that CELED and Learning Upgrade actually existed before the Communities Competition, and they have been adapted for it. Okay, so Kathy says the biggest dilemma they face is that students need more time for synchronous and face-to-face to make good progress. So I think that's an observation made by someone who's explored ways to implement blended learning. So maybe, knowing that there are ways you can adjust your program delivery that allows for that. Or maybe having tutor-supported face-to-face learning circle time where learners provide more peer support to each other like they do in the learning circles in Rhode Island in the Providence Public Libraries. Some other interesting ideas coming in here. Weekly webinars. That's great. So Kathy had weekly webinars to provide support. That's wonderful. And the archives are great because then students can watch them. That's great. Okay, so thank you for sharing your ideas about what you're doing. And I hope that these suggestions are interesting and motivating in pushing a different way of work. All right, so the second area that we're going to talk about a little bit more briefly is how to think about assessment in terms of distance and the online part of blended learning. Essentially, when I think about assessment in this mode of teaching, we need to understand that the online tools are decent. So like a proprietary curriculum are decent for providing formative assessment for the learners because they'll get immediate feedback if they get something right or wrong. But what's a little bit harder is that it's hard sometimes for a teacher to understand what particular learning needs are if that's the only form of assessment by which they're gauging progress. So we have recommended multiple ways to do this track to understand learners' progress. The first is that there should be some way that you're keeping a record of assessments that your students are taking. So you can, of course, start with your big assessments, the TABE and CASA score or GAD practice tests, but then also if they're doing other forms of formative assessment or summative assessment, you're going to want to track progress somewhere, especially if you're a program that has teachers collaborating in support of a group of learners to support distance learning. And some of these other modes of assessment that can be really useful are listed here in this diagram. You all know from your experience being a classroom teacher and what we learn in teacher education programs is that in order to have a true sense of a learner's skill, you need to offer different forms of assessment because not every learner is going to respond the same way to one assessment format. So the more variety that you have in your formative and summative assessment, the truer picture you'll get about the learning needs and competencies of any one learner. So I just want to preview or highlight what some of these different forms might look like. And again, this is all coming from observed use in distance and blended learning programs across the country for about the last 10 years. And these are things that are in practice and seem to be working pretty well. So obviously reviewing the student work online, we're starting in the blue shape up here on the left. Just going into USA Learns or CELED or whatever tool it is that you're using to review student work and provide additional feedback through the portal if you can. Going around clockwise here, sometimes especially if you're in like a project-based learning environment, you might have a culminating activity to demonstrate new skills. Say you did a workplace or a career exploration and job search unit in an English language arts class or an IEL civics class. You could have like creating a resume as a way to demonstrate some of the work that had been done at a distance to show, so that the students can show you what they've learned. If you're doing kind of project-based learning and you're working toward a culminating activity, using progress checklists on a particular project would be really important. You could also blow that up, and from a higher level, you could have project checklists that correspond to goals that learners have set at their orientation. Extra quizzes, like the quizzes that are just provided in the online curriculum should definitely be used, and responses explored so that you can assign supplemental work as needed. Meeting regularly with students is important. We talked about this before in communicating with learners in supportive instruction, but the actual communication could be a form of formative assessment where you're really digging down into what a student knows or needs to know on a particular area, and then responding with supplemental practice and explanations, demonstrations, whatever is needed in the moment. And then finally, there's been some really interesting work that's happened using portfolios to track student work. And so actually maybe you start with an online sort of curriculum, and then you might assign portfolio activities that list whatever skill area it is they're working on in their online curriculum into a more relevant day-to-day sort of artifact that supports that serves as an extension into use of the academic skills into the real world. So these are all things that others who've had connections with IDEAL Consortium states have been using, and would love to know if any of you are making use of these, or if there are other assessment activities that you've integrated into your programs that you'd like others to know about. So feel free to just chat what it is you're using. If you're doing something unique like a portfolio or a culminating activity, if you're doing teacher-created tests, let us know a little bit about what those things look like. Kathy's doing weekly forms to individual students, okay. Meeting with students one-on-one. Oh, a goals journal in Blackboard, that's really interesting. Performance reviews and self-assessment, that's really interesting, Luann. Oh, Sharon Rom, that teacher in California I was talking about, had weekly self-assessments that she put into SurveyMonkey. If you can do free SurveyMonkey questions if they're no longer than, or surveys if they're no longer than 10 questions long. So she would have a student self-assessment at the end of every week. Students would do the SurveyMonkey, and it would help her understand what she needed to focus on with students in the following week. So really creative use of a free technology. Oh, and Kathy, I'm wondering what you said you're creating forms. Is that in Google Forms that you're doing this work? And what Kathy's responding to that, I just want to note, I love that, oh, Blackboard, doing that on Blackboard. And I love how some of the self-assessment that Kathy's providing is not just on skill, but on engagement issues. That's great. Luann is asking for a template. And Luann, maybe a little more detail here. I'm not sure what kind of which template or who you're referring to. These are some really great ideas. And I love how some of these, again, oh, the questions Kathy uses for her self-assessment. That'd be great, Kathy, if you could share that with Luann, and then she can distribute it more broadly. And I'd love to see that too. Right, so the lesson learned for me here, what I'm taking away from this is to not forget that there's affective support that can be achieved through assessment activities too. That did not pop up as a really salient component in the work that we did before, but I agree that it is definitely necessary, especially when we're working with learners who are new to using technology to learn, and as the technologies are getting more sophisticated. Great. Well, some excellent ideas here. Are there other questions that people want to pose to each other or share with the group? I actually even think that, if you have something that you'd like to share, you could raise your hand and Mike could unmute you. There's a very lively chat discussion going on between Kathy and Luann. And we didn't do mic checks, but if anybody feels like they would like to contribute by talking, you can raise your hand and Mike can unmute you. No, Kathy, you're great.
And just for the record, the hand raising option exists right above the chat box where you see the little panel of icons and reactions to have. So if you click the little hand, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Yeah. So, Kathy or anybody else who has some ideas or responses to the stuff that's been chatted, we'd love to actually hear your voice. We have another 5 minutes here, and we can definitely use the time in conversation. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions.
Go ahead.
I think
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, Jen. I just wanted to thank everybody for their great sharing, and I'll type my email address for Massachusetts folks. Most of you know how to find me, but just in case, I'll type it. Because if you have these kinds of tools, I mentioned it in the chat, but in case people didn't see it, we're creating a Google folder with like resources and tools and samples so that the folks who are doing DL will have access to them. So for example, if Kathy can share her questions for the self-reflection, we'll post them there so everyone has access to. So I'm gonna put my email in, and if you all are doing, interesting and different stuff, so if you have any of these kinds of tools that you'd be willing to share, that would be great. Email them to me, and as we get the folder set up, we'll make sure that everybody on these webinars and folks on our list who are doing distance learning get access to it. So thanks for all your sharing, because it's all good and interesting stuff that people can choose to adapt or use or modify or whatever, but certainly better than having to look at a blank piece of paper and reinvent the wheel. So thank you for that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Luann. Okay, so I think we have several people from Massachusetts, several people from Virginia on the call. You are part of the consortium already because your states are members. If you are not from one of the states pictured on the slide here, I encourage you to go to ideal.worlded.org and learn a little bit more about the consortium and how your state can become a member. Membership impacts teachers. For example, in Massachusetts, Luann is the representative from Massachusetts in the consortium, so she gets access to all of the effective practice that is happening and shared by leaders across other states, but then gets shared with teachers. So, for example, this Google Doc that was created in Pennsylvania, she has access to. So, as Luann said, it's all about making it possible for teachers to build on each other's work, so not everybody is doing everything from the start by themselves. And we basically we facilitate it. So the facilitation is the fun part because I get to hear about all this great work that happens across the country. Okay, so that concludes the webinar. I've just chatted my email address, jen_vanek@worlded.org. I welcome your questions and feedback, and for those of you who hung on through all three in this series, I recognize your names, and it was really fun to see you returning. And again, thank you to Luann and the Sabes team for opening this up in the spirit of the IDEAL Consortium and making this possible for other states too. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have a great week. Bye.